The bridge had been there longer than anyone currently living around the lake. Long before manicured lawns, before gated entrances, before glossy brochures advertising exclusive waterfront living. The bridge had stood quietly across the narrow stretch of water, connecting two pieces of land that belonged to one family for over a century. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't modern. But it was solid, built with stone and timber by hands that understood weight, water, and time. For generations, the bridge wasn't just a crossing. It was part of the land's identity. It survived floods, droughts, ownership changes, and development booms. It outlasted the rise and fall of nearby towns. And most importantly, it was legally protected, documented in land records that predated the very idea of a homeowners association. That detail, however, would soon be ignored. The trouble began when the HOA arrived. The lake had always been private, but quiet. That changed when a developer saw profit in turning the surrounding area into a luxury resort-style community. They marketed lake views, kayaking amenities, and weekend retreats for wealthy buyers looking for controlled perfection. What they didn't market was the fact that the lake, the dam, and several surrounding access points were governed by century-old water rights that did not belong to the HOA. Those rights belonged to one property, the same property the bridge sat on. At first, everything seemed manageable. Construction noise came and went. Surveyors walked the land. HOA trucks drove by slowly, measuring and photographing. It felt like the usual discomfort that comes with development. The bridge remained untouched, quietly spanning the water like it always had. Then came the letters. They arrived with official-looking headers, legal-sounding language, and an unmistakable tone of authority. The HOA claimed the bridge was unsafe. They claimed it violated new community standards. They claimed it interfered with planned lakefront improvements. They claimed, most boldly, that it sat on HOA-controlled land. Every claim was wrong. Property maps showed the bridge fully within private boundaries. Historical records confirmed its protected status. Even the county had it listed as a non-removable structure unless approved by the landowner. None of that seemed to matter. The HOA had money, lawyers, and confidence. They had convinced themselves that resistance would fold quickly. It didn't. Weeks passed with no response from the HOA acknowledging the documents that disproved their claims. Instead, the pressure increased. Warning notices escalated. Fines were threatened. Access around the bridge was restricted. HOA patrol vehicles began parking nearby, as if their presence alone could rewrite history. The bridge stood firm, quiet, unmoving. Then one morning, the sound came. Heavy machinery doesn't whisper. It announces itself. Engines roared. Metal clanked. Tracks crushed gravel. From the far side of the property, bulldozers rolled in, escorted by trucks wearing the HOA's logo like a badge of authority. There was no final notice. No legal resolution. No court order. Just action. The machines approached the bridge as if it were already condemned. As if it were debris. As if 100 years of history meant nothing compared to a development timeline. Workers moved with practiced efficiency. Stone was pushed aside. Timber cracked. The structure that had survived generations was reduced to rubble in hours. By the time the engines shut off, the bridge was gone. The lake water flowed where it shouldn't. The shoreline changed shape. Sediment spread into areas that had never seen it before. And just like that, something irreplaceable vanished. The HOA celebrated quietly. They framed it as progress, as safety, as improvement. Internally, they congratulated themselves for standing firm. The bridge, they believed, had been an obstacle. Removing it was a victory, a necessary step toward full control of the lake and the resort vision they were selling to investors and homeowners. What they didn't celebrate was what they didn't understand. Because while the bridge was gone, something far more important remained untouched. The dam. Hidden upstream, old but functional, reinforced over decades, the dam controlled the entire lake. It wasn't decorative. It wasn't ornamental. It wasn't symbolic. It was operational. And unlike the bridge, it wasn't even remotely under HOA jurisdiction. The water rights tied to that dam were older than the county records themselves. They granted full control over water levels, flow timing, and release authority to the same property owner whose bridge had just been destroyed. Those rights were never transferred, never sold, never absorbed into any HOA agreement. They were ignored. As news of the demolition spread, homeowners near the lake noticed changes. The shoreline looked different. Dock alignments seemed off. Water clarity shifted. Maintenance crews scrambled to adjust landscaping that was no longer matching their designs. Still, no one connected the dots. The HOA assumed silence meant submission. They assumed the problem was solved. They assumed the lake was theirs now, fully and finally. Behind the scenes, documentation was being gathered. Records were being reviewed. Engineers were being consulted. Legal options were weighed and then set aside. This wasn't going to be resolved in a courtroom. It was going to be resolved through something much older than contracts and committees. Control. The same way the land had always been managed. The same way it had survived for a century. By the end of the week, inspections were completed. Calculations were finalized. The dam gates, which hadn't been adjusted in years, were checked and cleared. Every step was legal. Every action was within the rights granted long before the HOA existed. The lake shimmered peacefully under the sun, still full, still calm, still reflecting the resort buildings along its shore. No one attending HOA meetings that week realized they were sitting beside a body of water that was no longer guaranteed to be there tomorrow. And as the sun set over the damaged shoreline where the bridge once stood, preparations quietly moved forward for a response that would be impossible to ignore. Because if the HOA believed destroying a bridge was power, they were about to learn what real leverage looked like. The dam gates didn't open with drama. There were no alarms, no announcements, no warnings posted for the benefit of those living comfortably along the shoreline. The mechanisms were old, heavy, and designed to do exactly one thing: control water. When they shifted, it wasn't loud enough to draw attention, but it was decisive enough to change everything. Water began moving. At first, it was subtle, a slight current where the lake usually sat still, a barely noticeable drop in level that only someone deeply familiar with the shoreline would catch. Rocks that were normally hidden began to peek through near the edges. Birds adjusted where they stood. Fish moved toward deeper sections without anyone noticing. The HOA didn't notice. That morning, the resort staff went about their routines. Maintenance crews watered lawns that were designed for a lake that would soon no longer exist. Landscaping teams trimmed hedges along walkways meant to frame reflective water views. Booking managers confirmed reservations for weekend guests expecting kayaking, paddleboarding, and sunset photos over a full lake. By afternoon, the first complaints started quietly. Dock owners noticed their platforms sitting at strange angles. Floating walkways no longer floated the way they should. Water lines on retaining walls were visibly lower than they had been the previous day. Pumps that fed decorative fountains began pulling in air. Still, no emergency meeting was called. The HOA assumed evaporation, seasonal change, or temporary drainage related to maintenance. They had full confidence in their control. After all, they believed they owned the lake now. They believed they had removed the final obstacle. By the second day, denial became harder. The waterline dropped enough to expose mud flats where boats used to tie up. The lake's color shifted as sediment stirred from the changing flow. The shoreline pulled back in uneven patterns, revealing trash, rocks, and old debris that had been submerged for years. Kayaks rested uselessly on slanted docks. Paddle boats scraped bottom before reaching open water. Guests noticed. Refund requests increased. Reviews mentioned unexpected conditions. Photos circulating online showed a lake that looked sick, shrinking, and neglected. The image the HOA had sold was beginning to collapse. That's when the calls started. Engineers were contacted. Environmental consultants were rushed in. Emergency inspections were ordered. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Where was the water going? The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't comforting. The dam was upstream. It always had been. But in the HOA's paperwork, it barely existed. It was treated like a historical footnote, an inactive structure with no operational significance. No one had bothered to verify control because no one believed they needed to. The lake had always been there, so they assumed it always would be. By the third day, the truth began surfacing in pieces. Water flow measurements confirmed intentional release. Not a breach, not a failure. A controlled, regulated outflow. Fully functional, fully legal, and entirely outside HOA authority. Panic replaced confusion. Emergency meetings were scheduled. Lawyers were looped in. Phone calls were made to county offices that had nothing to offer beyond confirming what the old records already said. The water rights were real. The control mechanisms were real. And the person exercising that control was well within their legal boundary. Meanwhile, the lake continued to fall. What had once been a centerpiece turned into an embarrassment. The luxury resort suddenly looked like it had been built around a mistake. Exposed lake beds stretched wide, cracked and muddy under the sun. Smells rose that had been trapped underwater for years. Algae clung to rocks and pilings, drying in thick green mats. Property values reacted instantly. Listings quietly disappeared. Potential buyers backed out. Homeowners who paid premiums for lakefront views stared at expanding stretches of dirt between their patios and the waterline. What was supposed to be calming became unsettling. What was supposed to be exclusive became unstable. The HOA tried damage control. Statements were drafted. Temporary explanations were floated. Blame was shifted toward unexpected infrastructure complications. None of it stopped the water from leaving. None of it slowed the release. By the end of the week, the lake had lost a massive portion of its volume. Boats sat grounded. Fish populations struggled as water temperatures changed rapidly. Wildlife relocated. The ecosystem that had been marketed as pristine was visibly stressed. Regulators began paying attention, not because of the dam, but because of the HOA's inability to explain what was happening on land they claimed to control. Behind the scenes, the financial damage became impossible to ignore. The resort's valuation dropped. Insurance companies asked hard questions. Investors demanded answers that no one could provide without admitting the truth. The HOA board members, once confident and aggressive, now found themselves reacting instead of commanding. All of it traced back to one decision. The decision to destroy a bridge they didn't own. The more the water receded, the clearer the lesson became. The HOA had mistaken visibility for power. They had bulldozers, meetings, and logos, but they didn't have authority where it mattered most. The lake was never theirs. As the exposed lake bed widened, something else became visible too. Remnants of the past. Old stonework, wooden supports, foundations that hinted at structures long submerged. History resurfacing as the water retreated, quietly reminding everyone that this land had stories older than any HOA charter. The bridge was gone, but its absence had triggered something far bigger than anyone anticipated. By the time the HOA formally acknowledged the situation, the damage was already beyond repair. The lake couldn't be refilled quickly. By the time the HOA accepted that the lake was not coming back on their schedule, the damage had already moved beyond water levels. The physical loss was obvious, but the real collapse was happening in boardrooms, inboxes, and financial statements that no one wanted to sign their name to anymore. What had once been marketed as a $4 million luxury resort now looked like a half-finished promise built around a missing centerpiece. The drained lake changed everything. Homeowners who had paid premium prices for lakefront property realized they were no longer waterfront. Their views stretched across cracked earth and exposed stone instead of shimmering water. Docks became useless structures leading to nowhere. Kayak racks stood empty. Marketing banners were quietly removed from the entrance before more potential buyers could see the truth. Property appraisals dropped fast. Banks took notice. Refinancing applications stalled. Insurance providers began re-evaluating coverage tied to water features that no longer existed. Investors who had once praised the HOA's aggressive development strategy started demanding audits and explanations, and all roads led back to one event: the demolition of the bridge. Once legal teams began tracing the timeline, the story unraveled quickly. The HOA had acted without proper authority. They had ignored documented land boundaries. They had bypassed required approvals. Most damaging of all, they had interfered with a property tied directly to historic water rights they never bothered to fully investigate. The irony was impossible to miss. In trying to remove an old structure they viewed as inconvenient, they had activated legal protections far older and far stronger than their entire association. Rested squarely on the HOA's decisions, not the person exercising their rights. The narrative flipped. Public opinion shifted fast once the details surfaced. Online discussions no longer framed the lake drainage as reckless. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about unchecked HOA power. Comment sections filled with anger directed at the board, not the landowner. The bridge demolition was widely viewed as the spark that lit the fuse. Internal pressure mounted. HOA board members resigned quietly at first. Some cited personal reasons. Others vanished without explanation. Emergency elections were announced, then postponed. Legal fees ballooned. Reserve funds meant for maintenance and amenities were drained faster than the lake itself. The resort entered a slow shutdown. Events were canceled. Long-term bookings were refunded. Staff hours were reduced. Vendors demanded payment up front. What had once been presented as a stable investment now looked like a liability no one wanted to inherit. Meanwhile, the land where the bridge once stood began to stabilize. With the water level controlled, erosion stopped spreading. Plans were made to restore the crossing in a way that honored its original design. Stone was salvaged. Foundations were inspected. The absence of the bridge had caused destruction, but it had also forced recognition of its importance. The difference this time was control. Every step forward was documented. Every action followed the rules that had been ignored before. There was no rush. No bulldozers arriving without notice. The land was treated with the respect it had always deserved. The HOA, on the other hand, faced consequences that couldn't be rebuilt. Lawsuits followed. Some homeowners sued the association for loss of property value. Others demanded reimbursement for misrepresentation. Insurance claims were denied. Responsibility was clear, and it wasn't shared. The lake remained partially drained, not as punishment, but as proof that authority. The difference this time was control. Every step forward was documented. Every action followed the rules that had been ignored before. There was no rush. No bulldozers arriving without notice. The land was treated with the respect it had always deserved. The HOA, on the other hand, faced consequences that couldn't be rebuilt. Lawsuits followed. Some homeowners sued the association for loss of property value. Others demanded reimbursement for misrepresentation. Insurance claims were denied. Responsibility was clear, and it wasn't shared. The lake remained partially drained, not as punishment, but as proof that authority doesn't come from committees, logos, or aggressive enforcement letters. It comes from understanding the land, respecting history, and knowing where your power actually ends. Eventually, a settlement was reached. The HOA formally acknowledged their overreach. Restoration agreements were signed. Restrictions were placed on future interference with protected structures. Financial compensation was arranged, though it would never fully undo the damage caused. The resort never returned to what it was advertised to be. Its name changed. Management shifted. Marketing shifted away from lake-centric promises to quieter, less ambitious claims. The area remained occupied, but the illusion of control was gone. As for the bridge, its story became part of local lore. A reminder that not everything old is obsolete. That progress without permission is destruction. And that sometimes the most powerful response isn't loud, dramatic, or emotional. Sometimes it's simply opening a gate that was always yours to open. The water flowed when it needed to, and stopped when the lesson had been learned.